Our next speaker is Marifeli Perez-Stable. She's a professor, full professor at Florida International University. She's director also of the center. You're not the director of the center.
Interim director.
She's the interim director.
I was interim director. Frank Mora is now the director.
Anyway,
Okay.
Marifeli is a very distinguished scholar, professor, and Cuba expert.
Thank you, Brian. And I am not going to touch on at least a few of the topics you brought up. But I want to start with a joke that made the rounds in Havana more than 2 decades ago, actually almost 25 years ago. I'll say it in Spanish. En realidad, el gobierno ya se cayó, pero todavía estamos en el papeleo. The government has already fallen, but the paperwork still has to be filed. Back then, I didn't think that there would be a quick demise of the regime, but I never thought that we'd give Jaime and ICCAS the chance to meet now and still be talking about the same thing. Analyzing Cuban politics is not an easy task, whether you are as Brian was for a long time, an analyst at the CIA, an analyst at the State Department or the Defense Department, a journalist, or in my case, a historical sociologist. After 1959, the revolution and Cuba fused, after 1959, Fidel, the revolution and Cuba fused into all-in-one package, a with us or against us mentality. Patria Muerte left no room for dissent, and so there were thousands of fusilados, tens of thousands of political prisoners, and hundreds of thousands of exiles. Unity, not even consensus, which implicitly allows for some differences, was the rallying cry. Less dramatic, but just as damning, was what Raul Castro much later recognized as la doble moral, saying one thing in public and another one in private, or talking in the hallways rather than in meetings. Rather than in meetings. Let me say that a lot has been said about the logros de la revolución, the achievements of the revolution, and I'm going to point out, I mean, obviously the economy is a great defeat. What's the word I'm trying to, the great disaster, thank you. But there's another one that is more intangible, and that is the Cuban people themselves. Whereas in 1958, a majority of Cubans, perhaps the overwhelming majority of Cubans, thought that a better Cuba was possible, I wouldn't even begin to approximate what percentage of the population today thinks that a better Cuba was possible. So the Cuban people have paid a very high price as citizens as a result of the revolution of 55 years, or of a regime of 55 years. Nonetheless, in the past 25 years or so, the political template of with us or against us, all or nothing, has run its course. It's been nearly exhausted. Fidel Castro is gone. Hard as it tries, the regime cannot extinguish the opposition. Most ordinary Cubans long ago stopped listening to what the government has to say. And yet, Raul and his inner circle go on politically as if the revolution's mantle were as vibrant as it was 55 years ago. Still, some things have changed. Raul is not his brother. He is not charismatic, so he relies on institutions, such as they are in Cuba, From the outset, he focused on the military, which is still the most important institution by far over all others. He has introduced changes that are anathema to Fidel Castro, the buying and selling of cars and allowing Cubans to leave and return, two things that Fidel Castro probably either hasn't been told or still gets sick every time he thinks about it. Unlike Fidel Castro, Raul is partly concerned with improving living standards. That his reforms haven't done so, and in some cases, like agriculture, have made things worse, pose a challenge. Nonetheless, he is unlikely to change the present course overnight, de la noche a la mañana, as his brother did so often. Fidel Castro ruled by force of his personality. Raul Castro rules more predictably than his brother. At the same time, Raul is in a bind. Raul and his inner circle are in a bind. Whatever hint of legitimacy the regime has left lies in the Fidelista legacy. The revolution's imaginario is the only one he has, and that's problematic. It is almost spent. Do most Cubans really care about what happened 55 or 60 years ago? Current policies, even as insufficient as they are chipping away at the Fidelista legacy and the revolutionary imaginary. Other things remain the same or are similar enough. Havana still has a favorable enough international context, most important, in the widespread opposition to the U.S. embargo. Neither that opposition nor the U.S. embargo are going to subside anytime soon. Venezuela, though it may falter sooner than later, not because there isn't an empathy or a simpatía between Raúl and Maduro, hard as it is to imagine that simpatía, but because the economy, unlike Cuba in the 1960s, Venezuela is in a better position because it is much more open to the world, and however repressive the Maduro government has been since February and before Chavez, the society breathes, and Cuban society breathes in silence. Although it is weakened in part because of Venezuela's weakness, there is the populist bloc in Latin America. And finally, recent developments in Ukraine also help Havana, at least symbolically. At home, Raul Castro is like his brother in that neither accepts that human rights are ours intrinsically as human beings, not theirs to dole out as they see fit, or trample on to make sure that ordinary Cubans understand the cost of overcoming la doble moral. What are some of the current and future challenges that this regime is facing? Will Raul leave the Cuban economy to his successors, whether in 2018 or later, in less dire straits than the ones he inherited from his brother? He and his inner circle, if the answer is yes, he and his inner circle would have to embrace reforms a la Deng Xiaoping in the early 90s. That is, wager their power on putting living standards at the center. That is, retaining power precisely because they improve living standards. Do they have the courage to do so? Do they have a blind spot? I think they do, in terms of feeling secure in these haphazard, step-by-step, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or vice versa, as Lenin once said. I do think they have a blind spot, but I've thought they had a blind spot for the past 25 years, and they're still there. So, but my question is, are there people in power in Cuba today who understand the strength of the Chinese position deriving from improvement of living standards? The Vietnamese to a lesser extent as well. There is no doubt that the armed forces are the strongest institution. The Communist Party pales in comparison. Yet the armed forces need civilians. The armed forces might well, in all of the scenarios that Juan Antonio pointed out, all 3 of them, would do better if it could bolster its credentials as an arbiter. But that's a hypothesis on my part. Will Raul Castro actually step down in 2018, with or without his, I don't think he's gonna, he's a military personality. He'll have his stars, and he'll probably continue to be secretary of the party, maybe not. And I think it's important to remember that though he said it in 2013, he also had said it in 2009, when he became president of the National Assembly. He said that he would serve 2 terms. So I'm not saying that this may or may not, that it is inevitable, but I would say that the odds are that he will. That is, unless circumstances unforeseen or perhaps not thought possible right here intervene. Raul Castro and the other históricos do not want to be the ones to preside over the regime's funeral, which would be their own. In the meantime, I'm hoping that this time el papeleo will be filed sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Marifeli. Would you be willing to say a little more about the Fidelista legacy, what you think is left of it, at least in the minds of the Cuban elite, the governing elite, and how many are there protectors, influential high-level protectors of some elements of that Fidelista legacy, perhaps in the military or among the diminishing number of históricos?
Well, again, my sense, many of these answers have to be what we sense, what we perceive. But the Fidelista legacy is nationalism and social justice. What kind of nationalism are we talking about? Whatever progress was made, however little it was made, has been made with the resources of other countries. So there is no, I mean, I'm going to mention someone you all knew and who was very dear to me, José Ignacio Rasco. In the early 1990s, I was talking to him, and he said to be Marifeli, but national dignity has to start with the dignity of the citizens. And I frankly hadn't thought about it that way. And I always remember him, because that is not something that neither Raul nor Fidel think of national dignity in terms of the dignity, which means the freedom to earn their own living and to express their opinions, among other things. So I mean, nationalism, I don't know exactly what that means. And social justice, their pronouncements against wealth notwithstanding, there are many, many Cubans who are living very well and will continue to live, many as a minority, but it's not a concentrated minority. I mean, it's not a small minority. And that's going to continue to happen. So I'm not sure, maybe Raul and some of in the clan, but that Fidel has lived so long probably has been the biggest the biggest undercutting of his legacy.
Thank you very much. Our